Welcome to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts.
Let's do it.
Welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. On the other end of this camera, with that cultural at the behind her there, is Loren Rosario-Maldonado, and this is her book called Becoming the Change. I told her I love the colorful cover with the woman, and she is joining us from South Florida. Good day to you, Loren. How are you doing?
I'm fantabulous. Good day to you, Greg. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Well, thank you for taking the time to impart some wisdom and knowledge about something that's occurring everywhere, but it's the power of cultural intelligence. Most people look at emotional intelligence, they understand what that is, but we're going to inform them about cultural intelligence today so they can become a little more culturally aware of what's going on in their organizations and what might be happen with relation to even the way people work together from different cultures would be an interesting way to kind of frame this up. But I'm going to let our listeners know a tad bit about you. You can all go to cultura.global.com to learn more about Loren and her company. We will have a link to that in the blog. But Loren is a business-oriented leader with a proven track record of building high performance, fast growing global organizations. She's been instrumental in transforming businesses of all sizes by driving financial performance, improving organizational effectiveness, and boosting innovation through people development and engagement programs. She's always been fascinated by the human experience and how it shapes behavior from her years of experience leading people teams from the ground up, and she understands how to empower employees to grow while delivering transparent and people-centric programs. She holds a master's degree of science in industrial and organizational psychology and is currently pursuing her PhD in cross-cultural psychology from the California Southern University. She holds a professional certificate of coach, a PCC designation through the Go Active Coaching Network. And she's a board member of the Girls Inc. of Greater Miami and a member of numerous and other civic organizations. Well, it's a pleasure having you on the show. I truncated that bio a bit, but for everybody, just go to the website if you want to learn more about her company, and we'll put a link to that. So, let's start this out. We were talking about David Livermore before we actually started the show, and he wrote in the foreword to your book that he spent 25 years researching, writing, and teaching cultural intelligence. Many of my listeners out there maybe have never heard of this term, cultural intelligence. And he said that he needed someone like you and your book to help him see what cultural intelligence looks like in the real world from your lived experience and the academically rigorous research you've done. Talk to our listeners about what cultural intelligence is and why David Livermore was such an influence on you.
Sure. Cultural intelligence is really, the academic definition is a framework that helps you relate, understand, and adapt to diverse situations in diverse contexts. For me, cultural intelligence is about learning how to relate and work effectively with people who are different from you. Culture has somewhat of a misguided identification or perception, which is that it's about ethnicity and national origin, but it's more than that. It's basically referring to a group who does things in a certain way, and that could mean a difference in functional area as much as it can mean being an Android lover or an Apple, an iPhone, an iOS lover, right? So culture comes in so many different ways and forms. And David Livermore's work made such a profound impact on me because at the time when I came across his work, I was head of HR for this global organization. And so these were nuances that, like your listeners, to your point, were foreign to me, yet played a major role in how I was leading individuals from all over the world. And the more I looked into David Livermore's work, the more I could relate and the more it resonated with me. Um,
Mm.
and so it really sparked a lifelong mission for me to not only learn about this, but also educate others and how to use cultural intelligence to navigate not only relationships at work, but at home as well.
Well, your book does that, quite effectively. And one of the things I said to you before coming on the podcast was, your Dominican upbringing, right? And coming from the Dominican Republic and the kind of people that the Dominicans are, including yourself, right? You can't deny your cultural background. You can't say, well, I'm not a Mexican when you're Mexican. You can't say, well, I I'm not a Muslim when you're a Muslim. You have these traits. And and you were really influenced by your family, and you used the word or the acronym choice that you could make to become the change. How is it that the influence was so wonderful to you, yet you wanted people to learn about not only just how people from the Dominican Republic worked, but also the rest of the world?
That's a great question because, part of making a choice, CHOICE, is understanding your background and your heritage. And you're right, I am Dominican, but I never really felt Dominican, right? My upbringing was a dichotomous one because I had these Dominican roots. My parents are both Dominican immigrants, yet I was raised in very, Anglo influenced environments. And so I had this dichotomous view of the world. And I think I was influenced by that in such a way that helped make me be highly curious as I interacted with different cultures. So even though I wasn't necessarily aware of the differences in a way that I could articulate them, I was aware intuitively that something was different.
Hmm.
And even myself with my own family, I talk about this in the book, where I am highly individualistic and I value my privacy very, very much. But my mom, my grandmother, my parents could never understand that, right? And so
Yeah, I
when
remember
I
you. I
would
remember you talking about your father never being on time, which just
take
bothered
on
the
time,
crap, bothered the crap out of you. He'd always be 15 minutes late, and he'd act like, "Oh, well, it didn't really make any difference." And again, that's part of the culture, right? I could say the same thing about Hispanic people. We joke here in Southern California. It's like, well, siempre mañana. It's just we'll do it tomorrow. But
exactly.
that doesn't work when you're working for companies that expect timeliness. You know, so these are just little jokes I'm making, but they're very real, right?
They're very real. And you mentioned, another key point. I'm talking about privacy, but time orientation, the way we view time is so different, never talked about, but it can impact everything from my view of a person whose value of time is very, what's called polychronic, right? They view time as a this nuanced thing that you can kind of play around with over
Right.
time. Whereas I am, monochronic and see time in a linear fashion, to your point. And
Well,
so
you were a
I may
global
think, I
director
used
of
to think
HR.
Yeah, and I used to think my dad was always late, and he's thinking, "What do you mean I'm on time?" Right? And imagine this in the workplace.
Well, you say that my wife was a school teacher, and this is funny, yet you know, the families would invite her to a birthday party for one of the kids in her classroom, and they would say it was going to be at 1 o'clock. And so she was a very prompt person. She's a teacher. She had to run, be there on time, whatever. She'd show up at 1 o'clock and nothing was put together. There was no cake out. There was nothing set. There was whatever. It's like, well, you said 1 o'clock in the invitation. So now she knew just to come at 2 o'clock because nothing was going to happen at 1 o'clock anyway.
Yes, yes. And there's a joke that sometimes people actually push back the time to accommodate for those that will start late, right?
Yeah, right.
Um, and it just happened the other day. I was with my father. I spent some time with him before I had another meeting. And 3 hours before the meeting, I start saying goodbye for the same reason, right? And
Give you enough time.
yes, no, 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 wait for me. I'll take you. Okay, but remember, it's at 5. It was like 2 o'clock at the time. And between conversations, and getting into different stores, of course, he drove me late. I got to the event late. So I had to message the person, and my time senses are like breaking out. And he's like, "Why are you so worried?" So
I
have
get it.
understanding how time is viewed around the world helped me not have a panic attack when I spent this time with my dad a couple months ago.
Well,
Um,
Lauren, you speak about areas where cultural value mismatch and they complicate matters and can escalate the potential for conflict. This is a great example of that, what we're just talking about. We're using maybe a silly example, folks, but the reality, there's many of these examples. This is the one. Could you please mention some of those areas where you see mismatches and the opportunities for what could be conflicts? There's one
of
right there.
course, there's one, and I highlight one in the book, right? There was a situation where, I am an individualistic, highly competitive, and a high achiever. Okay. I didn't understand how that is, that cultural preference is tied to individualistic societies like the US. Well, I'm always pushing for growth and helping others develop and grow and achieve and achieve and achieve and achieve. And there was this one employee that I, was working with that I would push and push for all these accolades and all these things, not understanding that her preference for achievement was viewed in a more collaborative and cooperative way, right? And so that cultural um, value mismatch caused me to view her as someone who did not necessarily want to achieve, whereas she viewed achievement, as a way through the lens of cooperation and working with the rest of the team and making sure that the team achieved our goals, not necessarily her own personal goals. And so that's an example of many, many different situations that can be exacerbated if you don't understand these cultural value differences and how they influence the way that you prefer to work and approach your goals.
Well, I think one of the things you did really quite well is you just said you have stories in there of several people, and they show the difference in the cultural values. If you
Mm-hmm.
would pick one of those stories and why the exercise of reflections on various facets of our to identify can influence how we relate to one another, right? So,
Sure.
you had a lot of stories in there, no doubt. And I think those stories help to exemplify the differences. And I think the listeners would probably get a kick out of one of those stories that you could tell that would exemplify the differences.
Yeah, I would say my favorite story of the entire set would be Sam, because here is Sam. who is neurodivergent and has his own set of, cultural values. He values time in a certain way. He needs to be structured in order to perform at his best. But his manager, did not necessarily understand his his way of viewing time because he's not neurotypical, for lack of a better word. And so Sam really gained the courage to articulate that with his boss in a way that is not customary of someone who shares his level of diversity.
Hmm.
And what I loved about Sam is that here is society saying that Sam is not supposed to or typically demonstrate this level of courage. But he himself knew that he needed to have a certain structure in order to perform. And so he summoned the courage to talk about that. That for me is the embodiment of not just cultural intelligence, but making a choice, right? And in turn, it prompted his manager to understand a different perspective from Sam's lens and from his lived experience. And isn't that what we want to see more of in the workplace? That independent of what exists around us, we can summon the courage to voice what it is that we need and help others understand what we require in order to be and perform at our best.
I think transparency, no matter what, is an important element. Um, and it's very important to let people know how you work, how you identify with work. And you spoke in the book about Daniel Goleman, and everybody here knows Daniel Goleman's work around emotional intelligence, EQ, social intelligence. Um, and there's actually one that I've just recently came across in another book I did an interview, spiritual intelligence. So they've used spiritual intelligence, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and now you've got CQ, cultural intelligence. Why, in your estimation, obviously you've written this book because you want to see change. That's the main reason is knowing what the culture is so that we can change that workplace environment. Why is it so important?
It's important because, we talk a lot about how we spend the majority of our time at work. And
113,880 hours we'll spend at work.
we should
With
have that
law,
plastered and like embedded in a wall somewhere that's visible all the time.
13 years is what it is. And I was doing an interview earlier this morning, which is why the guy used it in his book. We're seeing about now it's about $8.4 trillion in lost engagement. $8.4 trillion a year because people aren't engaging. It's a mismatch. There's no fit, right? I mean, you were an HR director, you get this very much,
Oh, yes.
but now you bring the culture into it and you can see like, hey, we've all talked about the great resignation here and COVID and what occurred and the movement of people between jobs because they're unhappy. Well, now you add cultural intelligence on top of this, and it just makes it more of a challenge for people to try and manage, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be a challenge, but it can also be a tool. It's definitely not a magic wand, but it's a good tool to have in your toolkit. And a lot of these differences, a lot of disengagement comes from the lack of understanding.
Hmm.
And because we are so focused on deliverables, we forget that it's through people that we achieve success in business.
Right. Right.
And when it comes to engagement, if you have a workforce of many different diverse perspectives, your first priority is to understand those perspectives so that you can build a workplace that where all those different perspectives can coexist, right? One of the biggest things I harp on is that we are all multidimensional. And a lot of the people I interviewed reflect that, like Sam. right? We are, there's more to than what you see. There's way more than what you see. And working effectively in diverse cultures is about that, is about understanding all these differences and how they play out in the workplace so that we can create an environment where everyone can contribute effectively while still navigating it and having the resources to navigate those differences.
Well, speak to the listeners about how they form their cultural preferences and prompts you used to help a reader in this book better understand our cultural preference. In other words, I think people say, okay, there's a cultural difference, but there's a cultural preference. I might rather work with X culture than I would Y culture because I know I can get more done.
Mm-hmm,
Right. So we're actually being biased because we've actually put a label on a culture. How do
mm-hmm,
we get rid of those labels and how do we better understand how we're doing that? Because, we maybe subconsciously don't know we're doing it,
right.
but we are doing it.
Right. No, great point. And one thing to understand about bias is that it's not something you get rid of. It is there because it was built time over time, right? Our biases are there to, in essence, as human beings and biologically to protect us from harm. Where they can become harmful is what we do with those biases. And if
Right.
we use them for, with bad intentions.
Well, I
And so
think
when it comes
we
to,
use them, Lauren, and we don't really realize it, but I'm going to use the word alienation. In
mhm,
one sense, we alienate others from us as a result of our preferences.
right. And because we have these cultural preferences, to answer your question, they are shaped based on our lived experiences. You don't necessarily have to be born in a foreign country or in a different region to necessarily inherit these preferences, right? Because they're influenced by our generational um, influences. They're passed on generation to generation, even if you never left a particular country. And so these preferences are shaped through those social interactions. And so they are a part of us. And understanding those preferences helps us then gain perspective into understanding others. And once you understand them and how they impact the way that you relate, the way you work, the way you interact with others, then helps you navigate those nuances and why cultural intelligence complements emotional intelligence.
Well, you had mentioned in the book, Lauren, that we all carry a cultural blueprint wherever we go. I
Mm-hmm.
like the term blueprint because it's like, look, it's who we are. That's kind of that's it. Um, and there are particular influences or their influence, y'all. They influence um, the workplaces. How do the cultural differences play out in the workplace? And I was reading in the book mainly like communications, decision making, these kind of areas, because now we're talking about the big thing, cultural intelligence, and we're saying we have a blueprint of it. And then now we're getting down to how this plays out. How does it actually play out?
Mm-hmm. Let's say communication, for example, it's something we do all day, every day, right? We know when you're looking at the cultural values that influence communication, let's take high and low context. High context involves people or cultures that prefer to leave the meaning behind the communication to the interpreter's perception, right? So they'll use less words and leave more that's open to interpretation. Those who value low context will be very explicit in their communication and more direct. right, in their communication. Well, does this mean that we view someone who speaks indirectly and implicitly as someone who's less effective in communicating? If we value low context communication, this one nuance can impact communication in so many ways in the workplace, because all of a sudden you're forming a perspective and a perception of someone whose communication style is different. And because it's misunderstood, or because it's not well established or well known, then you can take away a different meaning behind that exchange. And that's one little example of how these cultural values can impact so many of our daily interactions, from the way we build trust, from the way we manage performance. Does this mean that I will rate this person's communication performance any differently than someone who communicates in the same way that I do?
Well,
um,
considering you were an HR director for a global company, I have a question for you because I've had this happen now twice in 2 days. We don't think about cultural intelligence, but when we get on the phone for customer service and we can't understand the person on the other end, and we own a global company, and they're basically just speaking over you, right? They're just like it's a script. It
mm-hmm,
really does a lot to deter somebody from wanting to do business with that company if their, and I'm going to say language difference, but it's not
mm-hmm,
only language, it's literally how they relate to people as well on the phone, right? And having an emotional intelligence, like I think the people, honestly, that are working in many of the centers are emotionally intelligent devoid. They don't have it. I don't know what it is, but in many of the companies. Now, I will not say that about Apple. I will say
mm,
Apple has the best customer service, and literally, I think that's why Apple stays at the peak. I'll say another company, Jabra, does a
mm,
wonderful job at customer service. They bend over backwards, right?
mm-hmm,
But many of these companies are trying to cut, their budgets, and they're using people that don't relate to people that are buying their product, right?
mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, really? I know that's an off the wall question, but it's really not. It's a cultural thing.
Well, it's making sure that your workforce has the skills they need in order to work and relate effectively with the audience they serve. And service is no different, right?
Right.
To your point, that's a perfect example of not only emotional intelligence, but understanding the cultural nuances behind the audience that you're serving. And so when you are developing those skills in your employees, helping them become attuned to that, right? That when if you are, let's say, that polychronic, high context communicator, very indirect communicator, that you have the preference to speak over others when you are speaking, understand that these are skills that you can adjust when you're speaking to a culture or an audience that does not have that cultural preference as their dominant preference. And so it's a skill that they may not bring with them, but they can certainly learn with development over time. It is a skill that can be developed.
It can be learned. People say that people aren't natural born salesmen, but they can learn to be salespeople, right? And you stated in the book that the world is more connected than ever, making cultural intelligence and cultural humility essential. I like that term, cultural humility. Can you speak with us about the choice playbook, which we had a few questions back, and how this can help us solve our differences? Because your
So the
acronym choice stands for CHOICE, it's an acronym. So,
Yes, it's an acronym. And so it's courage, it's humility for cultural humility, it's openness to new experiences, but integrating. the knowledge into your taking action, right? Taking action. The curiosity behind all these differences. And last but certainly not least is empathy. It's that big E word that everyone, particularly when it comes to engagement, loves to pitch, but not necessarily understands how to cultivate that. And so the choice playbook came about after, long and extensive research on how we can create situations, what I call moments that matter, whether at home or at work, that help us, connect better. And what I like about humility, for example, is that it calls for that critical self-evaluation, that ability to stop and take perspective on how we do this. To your point, that customer service person that's on the phone doesn't necessarily have to wait for the organization to help them develop these skills, or the client on the opposite end. They don't have to wait for someone to help them understand why this person speaks over them. That there is a cultural definition behind this, and how we can all learn to build that bridge through understanding. So the choice was a playwork that was developed to help people understand how. We understand what. We understand that we need to connect better. We understand that we, need to collaborate better. We understand that we all want to be engaged. But how do we do that? And so that's what the choice playbook helps people do.
Yeah, and I just want to tell my listeners this book has the choice playbook in it. Um, and I love the acronym, and I'd like for you to repeat for the listeners the main for each one of the letters again, because sometimes in sets of three, that's what you remember. So let's do for number two here. So just go through them one more time.
Of course, it's the first C for courage,
Okay.
H for humility, cultural humility,
Hmm.
I for integration.
What about O?
I'm sorry, O for openness, open to new experiences, right? I stopped at
Mhm.
three. I for integrating what you learn through those experiences. The second C for curiosity, remaining curious at all times.
And
And
empathy.
last but and empathy.
Yeah. If we just took those words and strung them together and we attempted to build all of our relations around those, Loren, the world would be a better place.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the last one with empathy. And it's so challenging sometimes to reach the empathy when there's such a big gap in understanding, right? And I think to bring that understanding, one of the things that you have to do, and there wasn't an L in there, is we've got to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's a big one. So, with that, in kind of wrapping this up, what I'd like to ask you is to leave our listeners with three actionable bits of advice that they could use both personally and professionally within their organization to help them better understand the differences amongst between themselves and others, and how to better understand the CQ or cultural intelligence. And what would your advice be to them to enact? In other words, an action kind of situation here. What can I do to be the change? You said, let's be the change. Well, if we're going to be the change, I think Magandhi, it was like, if I be the change that I want to be, I actually have to act it.
100,000%. And I would leave you with this. First, understand that our cultural values impact everything, every area of our lives. Two, understand that we are all, no matter where we're from, multidimensional. And what does that mean? We have many different dimensions behind our identity. And third, nothing happens if you don't take action. Understand your cultural value preferences and how they impact you, not only as a leader, but as a person navigating the world.
Great bits of advice. One last quick question for you. You know, years ago, I used to go to conferences in San Francisco, spirituality in the workplace. And they would always find companies like Patagonia there, Cliff Bars, people like that who literally, okay, call us here in California a little freaky. Sometimes we are. But the reality is, I wouldn't say that all HR directors were like, hey, let's beat a drum and kumbaya. But they did understand that spirituality in the workplace was a huge factor. If I couldn't bring my spirit to work,
Mm.
I mean, I can't bring myself, right? What would
Hmm.
be your position around? I'm just going to be this the final question because I kind of threw this one at you, which the cultural intelligence and the spiritual intelligence that need to blend together to make the workplace a better place for us to work and be.
Right. No, that's a great question. Anything that helps enhance the employee experience is something to be mindful of and certainly learn more from. And honestly, this is the first time I hear of spiritual intelligence, so I'm very keen on learning more. I would say, spirituality oftentimes is misconstrued with religion, which is
Right.
why it's something that employers may want to kind of steer away from. But I would say that anything that enhances a person's lived experience, whether at home or at work, is certainly a great tool to have in your inbox.
And I would concur with you on that. And I would say when you're done, look up the word spiritual intelligence. You find
I
that
will.
there's been a lot written about it. But I also would say when a company is seeking to improve performance, improve engagement, increase profitability, increase innovation, um, all of these things that they want from, you know, okay, the balance sheet is our biggest expense is salaries for employees, right? Why wouldn't we invest? And I'm going to say to my listeners in the end, go to her website, which we're going to give up, and we'll have a link to it. But it is, I have to bring it up, is cultural, CULTURA dot global. Um, and go there because you would want to engage somebody like Loren to help you look at the culture and work with cultural intelligence. And as she said in her bio, greater levels of organizational effectiveness, greater levels of innovation, greater levels of engagement. And if these are the things that you're lacking, go to Lauren's website and check it out and look at all the resources and things that are there and get a copy of the book. Lauren, it's been a pleasure having you on Inside Personal Growth to speak with all the managers, CEOs, and people that are running these companies. And I know they get the message. The question is, are they going to take action about it? And so I'm encouraging them to take some action because this is something that next year in 2024 can make your company a better company. Go work with Loren, go get a copy of this book and check it out. Loren, thanks for being on Inside Personal Growth.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you for having me and letting me share this story. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Have a good holiday season.
You too. Many blessings.
Blessings.